Welcome to the Storypowers podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Paul Smith. Paul is one of the world's leading experts in business storytelling. He's one of Inc. magazine's top 100 leadership speakers of 2018, a storytelling coach, and best-selling author of the books The 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell, Sell with a Story, Lead with a Story, Parenting with a Story, and 4 Days with Kenny Tedford. When I was younger, my father told me to stop playing around and get a real job. Paul might be the only person I know whose father told him to quit a real and well-paying job and start playing around. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Smith. Paul, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. That might be true. I guess he did give me some kind of a backwards advice, but it worked out.
Yeah, and I heard you describe that experience of quitting Procter & Gamble after 20 years, was it?
Yeah.
And there was one line that I thought was amazing, which was, nobody gets a standing ovation at the end of a budget meeting.
Exactly. Yeah. So, it's been a big difference these last 7 or 8 years.
And it's one of those things that, unfortunately, I think a lot of people don't have the experience of, because, my experience is not quite the same as yours, but I had been doing the same job for a very long time, and I had no issues with the job. It's a perfectly fine job. But once you find that thing that you're really passionate about, and I think you described this when you were writing your book, that you were trying to sneak in time to write the book because you were enjoying it so much. And I'm finding the same, recording the podcast or preparing keynotes and things of that nature, it doesn't feel like work. So it's perhaps less that the jobs we're doing have a problem with them. They're just horrible. We hate them, but they feel like work. Whereas this doesn't.
Yeah. And that was one of my kind of criteria when trying to figure out if and how I was going to leave my corporate career, was finding something that didn't feel like work, something that I love doing so much that I would almost do it if they didn't pay me. Not quite, but almost. And that's a sign that you found the right thing.
And I've just read I think it's your latest book, The 10 Stories Great Leaders Tell. And as promised, it was read from cover to cover in under an hour.
Very good.
I thought it was amazing. I wanted to congratulate you on that, but also challenge you on something you said at the beginning. You said, that in all your experience, you've done all these interviews with executives, and there are more than 70 types of stories.
Yeah, does that sound like too many to you or not enough?
It sounds like too many. Because your 10 cover a lot of ground.
Yeah,
but 70 sounds quite a lot.
Well, and that's why I wrote the book, because 70 was a lot. But I think I covered 21 different types of leadership stories in my first book, and 23 types of character building stories for children in my Parenting with a Story book, and 25 types of sales and marketing stories in my Sell with a Story book. So I think that adds up to about 70, right? So in those 3 books, there are 70 types of stories and probably 250 examples. And I suspect I could write a few more books like that. And so the whole purpose of the most recent book is focus on what are the most important ones, because 70 is a lot of different stories. What are the most important 10? If you're going to start being a storyteller at work to improve your leadership capability, what 10 stories should you start with? And those are the 10 I think you should start with. But I think that there are many more after those 10.
And it's interesting that, because I don't know if this is, I'm assuming it's deliberate, but there are some people that talk on storytelling and write on storytelling that will focus very heavily on 3 or 4 types of stories. So I was just talking to Jason Reed, as I mentioned, and he said that he finds that a lot of people put a lot of focus on, say, the origin story, or maybe you have a value story or a client success story, whatever you want to call that. But this says, they're just shortchanging themselves, because there's all these varieties, and, an origin story is interesting too, but most of leaders are not necessarily telling their origin story, right? They're telling all sorts of smaller, perhaps more important stories on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I agree. And there are a lot of people who focus on these 2 or 3 most important stories. And, there are some stories that are more important than others. But if the only stories you ever told was your origin story and a sales story and a marketing story, and that's it, you're severely underutilizing the power of storytelling. And I mean, if you're interested, and we can go through, probably don't want to go through all 70, but I can share the most important 10, and I can talk about a dozen other types if you want to give your audience a feel for the breadth of purposes that stories can be used for. I think that would be a useful use of our time.
Yeah, I will pick you up on that one. But one thing I wanted to ask before is, I read the book and then I thought, okay, well, this is incredible. It's such a concise book, and it has a lot in it. I mean, you could stay busy for years just trying to master that. And then as soon as I finished, I thought, okay, but you've written at least 2 other more business-related books on storytelling. So you had to leave a lot behind to write that one. So other than the 10 stories, there isn't much you talk about within, structure and things of that nature. When you were writing, did you get that feeling of, but they're going to need this extra stuff? Or did you generally convince yourself that, no, this is enough?
Yeah, well, I of course I did. I want to include everything in every book, but the easy way to ease my mind at that is, well, if they want to learn that stuff, they just got to go buy my other books. It's in there, So this one was just supposed to be, what are the 10 most important stories I should tell? Give me one example of each of those 10 and give me a few tips to how to find that story and craft it myself. So that's all it is. And that's why you could read it in an hour. But, the book I wrote before that, Sell with a Story, goes into all the detail about the structure of a story and different techniques to create the right emotional engagement, and how do you create a surprise ending, and what are the 8 questions your story needs to answer, and how long they should be, and what level of detail should you go into and in the stories, and how do you guard against, too much embellishment versus being accurate enough. So, I mean, I really went deep into the nuts and bolts of how to craft those stories in previous works. So that just freed me up in this one to just be very focused on what are the most important 10 stories.
And are you signed up already for the 10 stories great salespeople tell?
No, I probably would just point you to the right chapters of that book. But I don't know. Maybe that's a good idea. I'll have to write that down and think about it.
I mean, I can imagine that. I imagine that comparatively, that this book would have taken you significantly less time to write. That one, if this one does well as it looks like it's doing, why not, right? I'm sure there's 2 or 3 10 stories you can get out of that. Well, I mean, you can write 7 books of 10 stories.
I think you may have just convinced me. That may be my job for the next couple of years.
The easiest sales pitch of all time.
Yeah, I think so. All right. I'm convinced.
The question I also wanted to ask was, because I genuinely thought, I mean, this is a very useful book, and it shot right up my list of books that I'll be recommending to people, particularly because it's so different. I read yours on the back of your mate Sean's book, Putting Stories to Work. And again, they're completely different beasts. And I mean, Sean's book, I think, is a lot more like your previous books. But then what I was thinking was, is there a chance that when you write this, 300-page book that covers every single aspect you can about storytelling compared to this one you just wrote, is there a chance that we're overestimating what someone needs to actually start telling these effective stories? Do they need all of that stuff? Or, is this tome that you just wrote enough?
I think it's enough to get started. So, I think that was Sean's first book, and Sean's a brilliant guy, and it's a great book. And my first book was my longest book. And I think that's what you do as an author. You've developed some expertise in something, you spent years researching it, and you write your first book and you're so excited about it. And so you want to write everything that you've learned in that book. And so it ends up being a big, thick book. And then by your 3rd or 4th or 5th book, you've already written all that stuff and you want to write just about the new stuff. So now, having looked back after having written 5 books on the topic, I think you can start knowing a lot less with something like storytelling. And maybe it's true with everything else. Like if you wanted to learn to play the guitar, do you need to start learning all of the techniques and everything you'd need to know to be a classical, guitar player and fill up Carnegie Hall with, people wanting to hear you play? Probably not. I mean, get a guitar, go take a few lessons, learn a few chords, and start playing around. And I think that's probably true with storytelling as well. And that was the purpose of this last book. Here are the most important 10 stories. Pick the 2 or 3 that are the most important to you right now, and follow these few simple steps to finding it for you and start playing around with it. And then when you want to refine it and get it much, much better, yeah, you might need to buy another book to do that, or attend a few more training classes or something. But yeah, I think with just a little bit of information on storytelling, you can get started in a confident way, and you can learn more later.
I think that if you want to learn the guitar, all you need to learn is the chords to Stairway to Heaven.
Maybe
that used to be the case.
Yeah.
when I was younger.
Yeah.
And just because I realized that I said Sean, and some people listening won't know who I'm referring to. I'm talking about Sean Callahan, who wrote Putting Stories to Work. I'm actually talking with him in an event in October. There is a storytelling congress, and I'll be I'm one of the people speaking on that one. Right. So you mentioned some types of stories. So one thing I wanted to ask you was, from your experience, what are the stories that leaders are worst at telling?
Yeah. So they're pretty bad. Well, they're bad at telling stories they don't know they should be telling as stories. Right. So compare that to like stories they know they should tell as stories, like the origin story that you mentioned. Most leaders know I need to be able to tell the origin story, the founding story of this company. And so they've worked on it, and it's, they've got it to where it's probably fairly decent. But most of them don't even know that they should be telling a strategy story. They know they should have a strategy, and they should have a strategy document, but they don't think they should have a strategy story. They think they should have a vision statement, but they don't know they need a vision story. So they're really bad at telling those two stories because they've never even considered telling them as stories. Whereas the founding story, yeah, they know that they've got to have that. So those are, I think, two of the worst: the vision story and the strategy story, because they know their vision and strategy, but they have no idea how to tell the story with it.
I'm surprised that you say that they know how to tell the origin story, because, the impression I get is that if people haven't been trained on this, or some people are just natural, right? But if they haven't been trained on the origin story tends to come out as boring boilerplate text on a website. In 19 something, where it's I don't think I've seen anyone describe to me their business and actually zero in on a moment, and when was the insight, when the insight happened. Is always this is who we were, this is how many of us when we started, this is how we grew,
here's how big we are now. I totally agree. So if I could correct it, I didn't mean that they're great at telling that origin story, but at least they know that it should be a story. Now they do it poorly because they don't tell the origin story. They tell the whole company's story from the moment it was founded, with $35 in the garage with two people, all the way to today where we're a Fortune 500 company. Well, that's not a story. That's a timeline. The story is just that moment at the beginning, that insightful moment that you said. And so, yeah, once I work with them, we develop a story around that moment. But at least it's not a surprise that there really should be a story there. Most people who work at, I would imagine, Microsoft would know about, Bill Gates being at Harvard and dropping out. And, they would know this, similar story about Michael Dell in the college dorm room in Texas somewhere, and, building computers in his dorm room, and, the Apple garage, so they've got a vague idea of the origin of the companies that they work for, but they really don't even know where to begin to think about a strategy story.
And what would you say is, out of the 70, something that is very rarely used, or maybe a bit obscure, that you found that, no one tells, no one knows it should be told, or maybe if that doesn't come to mind immediately, just a moment in business that people should be telling stories, but pretty much never are?
Well, so one that I think is obvious that is not used as often as it should is what I'd call a marketing story. So in the 10, that's the how we're different from our competitors story. Almost everybody's got a list of features and benefits that they're trying to sell, but that's not a story. We hear the 3 features and benefits about my product, and that's why you should buy it. Well, but tell me a story about somebody using it and being happy with it, or somebody using one of your competitors' products and being unhappy with it. In fact, tell those two together, and now you've got a story that is much better than the list of features and benefits. So that's one of the most useful stories I think you can tell.
There was one, I can't remember exactly if that was the vision story in the book, which you described someone writing a magazine article, newspaper article in the future.
Yeah, which that's actually useful in both the vision story and the strategy story. And I've seen several examples, and I've had my clients use them as well. But yeah, if you want to if you want to illustrate your vision, I mean, what is a vision? It's a picture of the future so compelling that people want to go there with you, right? So if you write, for example, a newspaper article, a fake one, obviously, one written in the future, looking backwards, and saying, here's where we are today, 5 years from now, looking backwards, it's so much better than where we were 5 years ago. You can really paint a picture of what a day in the life of a person in that future is after you've achieved your vision. And it should be a wonderful story, right? Like you're getting to make the whole thing up, make it up wonderful. And it ought to be something that's plausible based on your plans to get to that vision. And so I've just seen several companies who will, they'll pick the favorite reading material of their CEO or their general population there and write it as if it was that Wall Street Journal article or that Financial Times article or whatever, looking back, and it just makes it a more fun thing to engage with.
You said something just now about you making that up. Now, I think most people that teach storytelling tend to suggest that, apart from stories that never happened, that you're trying to imagine, that you shouldn't make up stories. You should use things that have actually happened. But my question then would be, in your opinion, how much can you genuinely craft those stories or edit them? So what are you comfortable with, and what do you think is going over the line?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, in my experience, 95% of the time that I need a story or one of my clients needs a story, we're able to find a real one that happened. There's no need to make up a story. About 5% of the time, they can't find one, or the ones they found are too confidential, and they, don't want to, they want to protect the anonymity of the people involved. And so we end up fictionalizing it so that, you don't do something you shouldn't do. But 95% of the time, you should be able to find one. But even among those that are true, I think your question is, how much can you embellish or edit or craft the story? And so here's my advice for that. I think you should be no more or less willing to edit stories. Edit's maybe not the right word. Embellish stories than you're willing to embellish facts. Okay. And so what that means is not too much, but more than nothing. So for example, almost everybody is willing to round off numbers, right? So if we had a 14.7% increase in sales this year, you'd just call that 15%, right? If your survey results on employee satisfaction were up 95% this year, you'd say we doubled our satisfaction rating, right? Now, that's not perfectly precisely accurate, but that's okay, because rounding off numbers it's literally a rounding error. And we round off numbers for very good reason, because you're giving people the level of accuracy they need without overburdening their cognitive load with precision that is unimportant, right? So 14.76%, it's 15%, right? So we're all willing to embellish numbers a little bit, but not much. Like if you rounded off 14.7 up to 20%, well, now that feels dishonest, right? So the magnitude of the change matters. So I think you should be willing to embellish stories a little bit, but not a lot, right? So you and in fact, I call it hard points and soft points. You don't want to change, the situation that the main character was in, the problem that they ran into, how they resolved it, and what the results were. But if you want to change the names of the characters or the exact dates or locations to kind of protect the anonymity of people, or, you can change things like that. And in fact, here's my acid test. If you ever tell a story in front of a group of people, and then imagine that whoever the story was about was actually in your audience and you didn't know it, and you find out after you told the story that the person the story was about actually heard you tell that story, then ask yourself these two questions. Would you be embarrassed at how you told the story? Or would they be offended at how you told the story? And if the answer is yes to either of those, well, you changed too much. If the answer is no, then you're fine. So that's kind of my acid test.
I tend to find that I don't mind details that are still within the spirit of what you're telling. So if you're wearing something awkward, but whatever that awkward thing is just doesn't translate to the audience, they won't recognize that as something awkward.
Yeah.
I don't know. I like I like superheroes. So let's say I was wearing, I don't know, a Wolverine t-shirt, but not everybody knows who Wolverine is. Well, now most people do, but if I just say a Batman
Superman.
t-shirt,
Yeah, Batman.
Superman, everybody knows, and
Yeah.
is the spirit. And what I've seen done, have told people that I don't have a problem doing is, if you have a whole bunch of minor characters that are just going to make it complicated,
Mm-hmm.
but all of them represent sort of the bored bureaucrat stopping you from doing something,
Mm-hmm.
which you're probably not even naming, then sure, just make the bureaucrat be the one person. Because otherwise you just complicate things beyond people's understanding.
I actually wanted to give you an example, my favorite example from your last question, because I loved your Wolverine example. One of my favorite examples of somebody embellishing a story in a way that sounds like they shouldn't do it, but I think it's totally justifiable, is this. So I had a guy in one of my courses. He told the class, at the end of the day, everybody developed their stories. At the end of the day, he tells his story, and his story is about going to New York with his wife on a trip, and they're about to check into a hotel. They get out of the cab, come from the airport, get out of the cab. They're about to walk into the hotel. The guy looks down the street, the long avenue in New York, and the sun is setting right at the end of the street. And that rarely happens in New York, that the sun is setting right at the end of this really long street. And he's a photographer. And he's like, oh, I got to get a picture of this. And so he's getting his equipment out and everything and going to take this picture. And his wife's like, honey, we got to go. We got dinner. We got a theater we got to get to. We're going to be late. We got to go check in. And he's like, you know what? You go stand in line to check us in. Just give me 10 minutes out here. I'll get this picture and then I'll meet you. And so they do that. And the whole story, the purpose of the story was, don't let these, unique moments pass by because of whatever, some mundane, trivial thing that you got to do. Capture the moment. And he tell the story and everybody got it and they loved it. And then he admitted later in the class, well, not everything in that story was true. And so then we're like, oh, really? Well, what did you make up? And we're thinking it was going to be this, horrible thing. And he said, well, everything about that story was true, except it wasn't my wife. It was my secretary. It was my secretary. And so, of course, then everybody's like, oh, you're such a terrible person. Oh my God, you're having an affair and you had this beautiful story, but and then he says, no, it wasn't that way. And that's why I didn't tell it that way. It was a big company event. There were, 300 of us checking into the same hotel at the same time. But, my secretary, we work together. So we fly together and we're in the same cab and we got there at the same time. We weren't checking into the same room, but we were all going to the same dinner and the same theater. And she's trying to make sure I'm not going to be late. And so she was just doing her job, trying to keep me on track. And he said, and I could have explained all of that to you, but that took longer to explain than the story took. Right. So I just tell the story and say it was my wife, because every time I tell the story with all the truth in it, nobody remembers the beautiful sunset and the lesson in the story. They're so focused on trying to figure out if I'm cheating on my wife or not. Right. So it's a distract. That accurate detail is a complete distraction from the beauty of the story. And so he just changes that, and then nobody ever asks him again. And having heard that, I think that's totally justified. What do you think?
I think that you touched on something there that is very important. Have you changed the truth of the story? The truth of the story is, I did not get derailed from this beautiful moment by these mundane things. Well, that hasn't changed. And I haven't changed the setting so that happened. It was all going to happen the exact same way. Then no problem. The question I wanted to ask was, a lot of business stories, people use business examples, right? So let me give you an example of mine, and this is 100% a true story. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I was living in Madrid, and my now wife was in Barcelona. And we saw each other once a month. And then I told her, listen, honey, when you come over for next weekend, bring a nice dress, because I'm taking you somewhere special. I've got a surprise for you. So she comes and she's wearing this lovely dress, and we go out. It's this beautiful old house. And we come in, it's a restaurant, and all the waiters are dressed in tuxedos. It's super kind of formal. There's someone playing the piano, and dinner starts, and it's all lovely. And she seems a bit quieter than usual. And then at some point, halfway through the dinner, the waiter sort of clinks on a glass, fork bangs on a glass. Everybody stops, and they start singing an opera. Because the surprise was that the restaurant was a restaurant, but also a classical music school.
Mm.
So throughout the dinner, that happened 2 or 3 times, and it was beautiful. And I felt that she didn't seem to be so much into it. And then dessert came, and she kept like picking through her meal, not eating very much. And it's like, okay, fine. And then I asked her when I got home, I was like, listen, I went through all this trouble, and it wasn't a cheap restaurant, but you just didn't seem to be into it at all. And she was like, oh, no, nothing, no worries. And then I found out about 2 or 3 weeks later, she said, listen, you know what? You told me to bring a nice dress, and you told me to take me something special, and you had a surprise for me. I thought you were going to propose.
Yeah.
So I kept looking for the ring in the middle of the food, thinking, well, surely it's hidden here somewhere.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand. Well, I don't understand women terribly well. And I clearly didn't understand who I was speaking to. So what I was communicating wasn't what they or she was understanding. And it wasn't just her, because she spoke to her friends. They all said 100% is proposing. There is no question about this. So I have used that story before to say, it doesn't matter how clear you think you are. If you don't know your audience and you don't understand how they are going to understand your message, then you might just be not only wasting that message, but causing yourself a problem, as I did.
Yeah. Well, I hope you married the woman eventually, right?
I have married her.
Okay,
yes, good. I have married her. So my question there is, that's obviously not a business story. Right. But I can clearly make a business point out of it. Mm-hmm. So in your experience, do you find that those more sort of day-to-day stories that have nothing to do business, do you find that they are as effective, or there are times that they just doesn't play in the way perhaps we think it might?
Oh, I think they're very effective. In fact, and it goes the other direction as well. In fact, the reason I wrote my second book, Parenting with a Story, was because when I was writing the first book, Lead with a Story, as I was letting people read parts of the book, I kept getting feedback. Oh, I could use that story with my kids at home. And I got so many feedback like that. I realized, leading people at work and raising kids at home, there's a lot of similarities, right? In both cases, you're kind of the boss, right? And you're genuinely interested in their growth and development, and your job is to point them in the right direction, and discipline them when they don't do right. So there are a lot of similarities. And so a lot of the leadership stories that I was writing in the book were really very useful for parenting stories. And then the reverse, I think, is true as well. I mean, stories the things that happen at home, like you just shared, can help us at work make better decisions. So yes, they don't all have to be work stories about things that happened at work. In fact, I tell people that a leadership story is any story that furthers your leadership objective. A sales story is any story that furthers your sales objective. So it doesn't have to be a story about selling or a story about leadership. As long as it accomplishes your objective, then it was a leadership story.
Parenting with a Story was actually the other book of yours that I have read. And, my daughter is turning 4 in a couple of, my oldest daughter is turning 4 in a couple of months. And she's already been bitten by the story bug, because I fell into this mistake of starting to try out my material with her.
Yeah.
And this is sort of baffling if you haven't, studied the power of story. It doesn't matter what story it is. I've told her like business stories, and she's interested in them. So one of the questions I had for you is, I'd imagine you tell your children stories. Mm-hmm. How do you avoid the, oh no, here comes another dad story problem, if you ever get that?
Yeah, I get it occasionally, but I avoid it by not forcing, I don't tell my kids my business stories, because I know that they won't be as meaningful to them. They're 15 years old or whatever. So, but I do share a lot of the stories that I think are more family, human interest, the character development, the stories like you found in Parenting with a Story. I do share those a lot. And in fact, they sometimes ask for them. Like they'll say, yeah, what was that? What was that story about the guy that did the whatever what was that? And I'll tell that again if they ask.
Yeah, there's one, I think it's the one that perhaps opens the book, the club sandwich.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't the club sandwich. The quiche.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
quiche.
It's both. Yeah.
That one is great. And do you have a short version of that? Because I love that story. I'd love that one to be on the recording.
Yeah, yeah. So I was probably 16, 17 years old. My dad got me a job at the company he works at as a file clerk. It was called Secretary's Day back then. That's probably Administrative Professionals Day now. I was so excited because it turns out my boss had to take me out to lunch on that day. And so my boss and I, and then all the other managers and their secretaries like me were at lunch. And it turns out my dad was sitting at the same table as me and his secretary. And when the waitress came around, they only had two options on the menu, a quiche Lorraine and a club sandwich. And this is back right after that book, Real Men Don't Eat Quiche, came out in 1982. All right. And so everybody knew that if you ate quiche, then you were less than masculine. Right. So none of the men were ordering the quiche. Right. And most of the women were ordering the quiche, and the guys were ordering the club sandwich. And which is exactly what I did. Right. Oh, I'll take the club sandwich, And it got to my dad, and he said, well, I've never had a quiche before. So how about you bring me half a quiche and half a club sandwich? That way, if I don't like the quiche, I got the half club sandwich. Well, the men just started abusing him immediately and calling him all kinds of names and, criticizing his masculinity. And of course, I was just terribly embarrassed by this and sinking down into my chair. And so after a few minutes of abuse, my dad calls the waitress back over. And of course, the guys are high-fiving each other because, we broke his spirit, and laughing at him. And so the waitress comes back over and he says, I'm sorry, I got to change my order. I ordered the half a quiche and half a club sandwich. I need you to take back that half a club sandwich, and you need to bring me the whole quiche. Right. And of course the guys were like, what? That's not what they thought he was going to do. And he ate that whole quiche right there. And I don't even think he liked it, but he ate the whole thing. And it taught me such a lesson about what it means to be a real man, which is to not care so much what other people think of you, and to do what you want to do and not be so motivated by that social acceptance. I don't even think he intended to teach me that lesson, but it did, and it worked. It stuck.
It also generates a lovely tagline, which is "Eat the quiche."
That's right. Yeah. Which I tell my kids now when I can tell they're doing something just because the other kids want them to, or that they're feeling peer pressure. Yeah. Now I just say, hey, Ben, eat the quiche. And then he goes, oh, yeah. Okay. So I'll do it.
That one was one of my favorites in the book. And the other one I really liked was the John Ray story.
Yeah.
So that's the one where the guy is crossing from Belarus, out of Belarus back into somewhere,
Poland or something.
Yeah. And then the Belarusian border patrol starts banging on doors. He doesn't have his documents and he's got his passport, and they call him to a room. And so he walks into, they look at his passport, say something to each other, take him to a room, and then he's there terrified because it's the Belarusian border patrol. And then they ask him to sit on a table, one guy behind him covering the door, one guy ahead of him. Then the guy opens a suitcase, gets a bottle of vodka out and 3 glasses, pours them, and say, John Ray, today is your birthday, isn't it? Happy birthday. That's incredible, because you can definitely feel the horror that guy felt being called by the Russian border patrol.
Yeah, and you told it he's terrified. He's thinking he's going to end up in a Belarusian, prison for the rest of his life, right?
If he's lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you have any that were your favorites? So stories that perhaps you knew already, or that after writing the book, they just stuck with you?
Well, so the quiche story is definitely one of my favorites. And actually the last story in the book is probably my very favorite, which is also about my dad. I don't know if you remember that one. But the reason it's my favorite is because it is quite literally responsible for me making the career change that I have. So it's the story that convinced me to leave Procter & Gamble and do what I do for a living. You want me to share that one with your audience?
Well, it's the story we referred to right at the beginning. That's why I said that your father was the only person that's ever told you to quit a job. Just tell the father part.
Yeah. So he when I was struggling with either staying with my corporate job or quitting and doing this for a living, I wrote my dad a letter and asked him what I should do, and he wrote me back and just told me a story about himself as a kid. He said, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life when I was 5 years old. I wanted to be a singer, like Frank Sinatra or Tony Bennett or whatever. And he said, I knew that for sure the first day of the first grade when the teacher asked any of us if we had any special talent. He said, I raised my hand and I said, I can sing. So of course, she asked him to stand up and sing a song. So he does it. And he said, I nailed it, right? I mean, I got all the words and melody right. And the teachers and the students stood up and applauded me. And he said, that's when I knew for sure that this is what I was destined to do with my life, to be a singer. And he said, unfortunately, that turned out not just to be the first time in my life that I ever sang a song in front of an audience. It turned out to be the last time in my life I ever sang in front of an audience. And he said, the truth is, son, I just never had the courage to go through with it. He said, there's not a month that goes by, and that's been 75 years, and that I haven't regretted that decision. And he said, someday you're going to wake up, you're going to be 80 years old like me, and it's going to be too late to pursue your dream. And as if that wasn't enough, and it was, by the way, he closed the letter by saying, I'd love to see you achieve your dream, but that doesn't mean in your lifetime, son. That means in mine. And I just thought, oh my gosh, like pressure, right? TikTok, the guy's 80, right? So I literally 2 days later, I walk into my boss's office and I resigned from my career to change my career. And it was absolutely the best decision ever made. And I would not have made it nearly that soon had my dad not shared that story.
And because this is something I couldn't quite piece together, because I've heard you tell that story, and I've read some of what you wrote around that decision and how exactly you got around making the transition. But what I haven't figured out, or that I haven't seen you say anywhere, is you worked for Procter & Gamble for 20 years. I've seen the list of jobs you did for them, lots of impressive stuff. None of that has anything to do with storytelling. Right. So how did you go from, okay, no, this is not soul food, I want to do something more meaningful for me. How do you go from that decision to, I want to teach people storytelling?
Yeah, you mean, so what was my exit strategy? Yeah. So
no,
my decision process.
Yeah, I mean, no, where does the storytelling come from?
Oh,
because that's nothing you did at all with, I mean, not officially at least. It didn't look like you were you were a manager, you had people that work for you, but didn't sound like someone who's naturally come across storytelling and would have been doing you're not a marketer that has decided to become a speaker. Yeah. So where does that come from?
Okay. Yeah, I get the question now. So I decided I wanted to have a career where I loved what I did all the time. Because like my theory is that most of us love about 10% of our job. It's why we went into the business in the first place or whatever, why we chose that career. And most of us hate 10% of our job too. I mean, office politics, filling out your expense report, whatever. And the big bulk in the middle, the 80% in the middle, we mostly just think, well, that's okay. It's good work. I mean, I wouldn't do it if you didn't pay me, but it's not bad. Not the kind of work you are excited to get out of bed in the morning and do, but it's okay. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I could just do that 10% at the top that I love, but that would be my entire job. Wouldn't that be cool? And so I thought, well, what is that 10% for me? And I realized it probably was only 5%, but it was the few days a year that I got to give a speech at the company annual event, or teach a new hire training class, or teach a class at, general manager college at Procter & Gamble or whatever. But it was when I was on stage teaching. That was the time that I loved my job the most. And it was only a few days a year. And I thought, well, how do you get to do that full time? Because there's no full-time speaker trainer at Procter & Gamble. Even out of the 120,000 people, there's not one. And I realized, well, you got to write a best-selling book and go around the world doing that for all kinds of other companies. So I said, I guess I got to write a book. Well, what would I write a book about? Well, what is it that I enjoy when I'm speaking and training? Well, I like it the most when I'm telling interesting stories. And when I included storytelling in my training courses, people loved it. And so that became, then that's probably what I should write a book about. So I went and researched storytelling and wrote a book about it. So it wasn't that I fell in love with storytelling. And so I, moved my career there, as I wanted to do the speaking and training thing. And I needed to find a thing that I was passionate enough about to make that my thing. And storytelling turned out to be that thing for me.
It's an interesting phenomenon, which I've seen in myself and in other speakers that talk about the subject, or people that tell stories in other areas, which is that perhaps because we're into story and we kind of know something about story, it's pretty easy to construct the story that led you to story. Perhaps we just don't realize, if you haven't looked at it, how much we tell stories. I read Sean's book, and one thing he was saying is, just try to spot how many stories people tell, like in any normal event at work or personally. And I was just having a socially distanced drink with a friend the other day, and I remember that exercise, and I said, okay, I'll just pay attention. And over the course of sort of 20 minutes, I might have told a couple of stories. He told a couple of stories. And then my wife came in and says, have you guys heard what happened to whoever? And then she told us. But I don't think that almost no one thinks of that as storytelling.
Right. Yeah. In fact, that's interesting you say that, because when I was researching my first book, I realized I wasn't getting anywhere when I was asking people to tell me stories. Right. And I didn't get any good stories until I started asking people to tell me about something interesting that happened. Then I got good stories, because people think about stories as things that they tell frequently. Oh, there's that story I tell about, my sister. Oh, I tell that story all the time. Well, now it's a story because it's something I repeat often. But if it's just something interesting that happened to you, they don't think of it as a story. It's just an event that happened, right? So I have to ask about events to get good stories. When I ask about good stories, I don't get much.
I've seen someone describe this as this phenomenon you're mentioning about people not realizing that they're telling stories is, gossip, for example. I mean, gossip is just perhaps not the nicest type of story you can tell about someone else, but it's a story.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, do you know what he did? This is what he did. Yeah. It's a story.
Can you believe what she did?
Yeah, I was speaking to a coaching client the other day, and I was saying, this is the process we're going to go through, and I'm going to help you find the stories, personal stories that we can use in the business and business stories we can use. And he says, oh yeah, that part's going to be a bit difficult because I haven't got any stories. And I said, have you ever gone anywhere or done anything? Have you ever made a mistake or learned something? It's like, yeah, but then there's a story behind that, isn't there? But I think it's just a word, and it just causes this mental block on people, and they just don't really know where to go with it.
Yeah.
And one of the last questions I wanted to ask you was, when it comes to business stories, or you teaching people in business to tell stories, I mean, there is a resistance there, which is kind of strange when people look a tiny bit into it. Everybody realizes that they love stories, but there's still a bit of a resistance. What would you say is the biggest mistake that people make when it comes to telling stories in business? Is it that they just don't tell them at all? Or they try, but they don't really know what they're doing? I mean, so what has been your experience with that? Particularly with people where you've done a course or a training and then followed up and found out, well, they're not doing it right, or they're not doing it at all. Because I know that happens.
Yeah, that just reminds me, I wrote an article on LinkedIn a year or so ago, and it ended up getting a lot of views and a lot of nice comments at the bottom. And then one of the comments was, there is nothing worse than a story told by somebody who's just been to a storytelling training. I thought, it hurt me so bad, because oh my gosh, well, that's what I do for a living. I wonder if people leaving my class tell horrible stories. And I hope that's not the case, but I think I know what she was talking about. What she meant was, when people come out of a class like that, they feel pressure to go tell a bunch of stories. Well, I just went to a storytelling class, so I got to go tell some stories. And so they end up telling stories when they really didn't need to, or when it wasn't appropriate, or because they just wanted to show off their new skill. And by the way, they're still learning the techniques, and so they're not very good at it yet. So you have people telling stories that they're not very good at when they maybe didn't need to. And so that's what people, you must have just been to that storytelling class, right? So that's part of I don't know if it's a mistake, but when you're new at something, you're new at it, right? And so you're not the best guitarist when you just are learning. You're not the best actor when you just start acting. So of course it's going to come across as not quite polished yet or not perfect yet. But I think that's okay. That's part of the learning process. I think the bigger problem is what you said, is that just not telling a story at all when they probably should have been telling a story. It's not recognizing that, oh, you mean I need a vision story? I didn't know I've needed a vision story. I have a vision. Oh, you mean I need a sales story, or I need it? They probably know they need that. I need a case for change story. I didn't know I needed that. That's the biggest problem. It's not recognizing that there are stories that you need that you probably don't have. That's the biggest problem. That's the biggest barrier to being successful that way.
one thing that probably explains that first problem you talked about when people just come out of the storytelling workshop, not yours, hopefully, or mine, but I think it's just
so.
when you're new, the seams will show whatever you're trying to do. So instead of saying, that problem with having the factory, I mean, I've seen that before. So to last year, they won't do that. They would say, well, I have a story about that.
I hate that. Yeah.
And they'll put the voice will change.
Yeah.
Well, 10 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and that's why those are actually two of the, and you probably do this too, the two of those specific things I tell people, don't do this. Don't announce you're going to tell a story before you tell a story. Just tell the story. And I tell them, like you probably do, if the tone of your voice changes when you enter storytelling mode, you're doing it wrong. You shouldn't sound like a kindergarten teacher, with a group of 5-year-olds around you. It should just blend into the conversation. So yeah, I kind of cover the common mistakes, like, apologizing for telling a story, asking permission to tell a story. Like, don't do that. Don't announce you're going to tell the story. Don't give away the ending of the story. Don't change your tone of voice. Yeah, all of those are very common mistakes.
One thing that I found effective, and it's the simplest trick in the book, and so some people are just like, is don't think of it as a story. Think of it as an example, a slightly longer example.
Yes.
But let me just give you an example of what I mean. Last year, whatever, and because it was like you give examples of things, right? An example typically is a story, and you don't say, let me give you an example. The numbers are blah 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 blah. I mean, nobody does that. But I again, I think. I said to someone the other day that, one of the most pretentious terms in business that there is storyteller. Right? If you call yourself a storyteller, there's just something just sounds a bit like, I don't call myself a storyteller on my LinkedIn profile. I say that I'm a storytelling coach or a speaker.
Yeah.
But you say I'm a storyteller. There's something about it that just
well, who isn't, right? Right. I don't refer to myself that way either, and that's for all those reasons. And I use that as well. The example, let me give you an example. For instance,
yeah. Paul, I'm mindful of our time, so I just wanted to ask you a couple of last questions. And the first one is: are you already missing the stage?
Yes, I am. This is not the same. This online presence. I'm doing my best to make it work for me and my clients, but I've got to admit it's probably not as exciting and as engaging as having somebody live on stage. And for me personally, I love to be a little bit closer to my clients. So I am missing it. I'm not missing all the time in airports, but I am missing the face-to-face time with clients for sure.
And it's important to contextualize that you are not one of the people who seems to have struggled at all with the technical challenges of the virtual speaking, because you've got a TV quality studio. I take it that's your garage or something.
Yeah, basement.
Yeah. So, that you're not one of the people that are saying, I don't mind it or it's okay. But then you have all these technical things you're trying, a camera, I don't know technology. I mean, you've got the technology now. I don't imagine there's many speakers right now that have that level of tech to present virtually. But yeah, I mean, I think the lack of feedback is the biggest challenge for me. The feedback from the audience and the energy and all of that is obviously very important. But also I think it's just difficult if you can't see how things are landing. A story, maybe you see a few faces and maybe they look interested, but maybe you're not seeing another 100 faces and they're bored, then you just don't know.
Right.
Right. And then the last thing I wanted to ask you is, if people want to find out more about you, where should they go?
Yeah, thanks. So my website's probably the best place. So that's leadwithastory.com. So it links there to all my books and training courses and stuff like that.
Paul, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, you as well. It was a fun conversation. Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves. And until next time. I hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, I'd love for you to subscribe and leave us a review or a rating on the Apple Podcasts app. It's very easy. You open the app and find this show. Then scroll down a little, and when you see the stars, tap. I'd really appreciate it, and it does help other people find us. And if you'd like to get in touch or find out more about what I do, reach out to me on LinkedIn or visit my website, storypowers.com.